Hello everybody, my name is Brandon. Welcome back to the channel. I'm here today to talk about my top 10 first-time reads of 2020. So it doesn't matter what year these books came out, it simply matters that I read them for the first time last year. So let me preface this by saying this is only my list. I'm not saying these are the 10 greatest books ever or anything like that. This is simply the 10 favorite books that I read for the very first time in 2020. So let me know down below what your 10 favorite were that you read last year. I would love to hear what your list is, because I'm sure that it'll be different than mine, and I'm sure that you'll disagree with mine, and that's totally acceptable. So I want to keep my thoughts on these books incredibly brief, because I want to try to keep this a little bit shorter than normal. I do have more elaborated thoughts on almost all of these books in either individual reviews, which I will mention as we go through, or in my wrap-ups, which you can find here on my channel. So I will try to keep these brief and condensed just for the sake of brevity. So let's not waste any more time at all. Let's talk about the top 10 books that I read for the very first time in 2020. Let's dive right in. Number 10 on my list is the only one that was actually released in 2020, and this is Clown in a Cornfield by Adam Cesar. So this is basically a YA horror book, and I know a lot of people said when they reviewed this that they didn't really feel the YA aspects of it, but I did a little bit, just with like the relationships between these characters. Some of it felt a little, I don't know, juvenile is not the right word, but it felt like teenage relationships. So that, I say that not to like point that out as a con of the book or a criticism at all, just an observation, I guess, my experience with the book. But Clown in a Cornfield, we are following a girl who has just moved from Philadelphia to this small city. I want to say they're in like Nebraska or something, somewhere kind of in the middle of nowhere where there's a bunch of cornfields. And her mother has just passed away, so we are following her and her dad kind of embarking on this new life together. She's making friends in her new school, and some of the townsfolk might say that these are the wrong type of people to become friends with. But anyway, she goes to this party one night. It is a raver in a cornfield. Do people even say ravers anymore? I don't know, whatever. It's a party in a cornfield. And then all of a sudden a clown shows up and he starts blowing people away. So that is the titular Clown in a Cornfield. And then it, of course, snowballs from there and gets pretty crazy. Like, this one was a little bit bigger than I was expecting it to be, but I really enjoyed it. Again, I really liked the relationships, even though they did feel a little YA to me. That doesn't mean they're bad at all. I really liked the characters, our main character specifically. I think if you don't buy into her, then you're not really going to enjoy the book at all, because her story is what this is about. So I really enjoyed this one. I ended up giving Adam Cesar's Clown in a Cornfield 4 out of 5 stars when I read it, and I just think it's so much fun. I cannot wait to read the sequel to this, which I have to assume is coming, because from what I could tell, this book had to do pretty well. Like, everyone has been talking about it on BookTube this year, so hopefully it did well for him, and I really am interested in checking out more from him, because he's a great writer. So number 10 on my list is Adam Cesar's Clown in a Cornfield. Number 9 on my list is going to be the only cheat on this list, so I apologize if you hate when people cheat, but this is a trilogy of books as opposed to just one book, but it tells one full story, so I'm counting it as number 9 here. This is the Themis Files trilogy, and this is written by Sylvain Neuvel, which, again, I apologize, I'm sure I'm butchering his name, but this is consisting of 3 different books from 2016, 17, and 18. We have Sleeping Giants, Waking Gods, and Only Human. I always forget the last one. So I really loved this trilogy. It is a sci-fi trilogy that is just larger than life. If you liked Pacific Rim or things like that, you like kaiju movies, you'll probably enjoy this series. So with the first book, which is the only one I'll talk about to avoid spoilers for any of the others, we start off with this little girl who's like bicycling down the road, and she falls into this giant hole in the ground. Well, instead of falling to her death, turns out she's like sitting on a gigantic metal robotic arm. It's the palm of a hand, rather. And so, of course, because there's a palm, there has to be more. So we basically are finding out in the first book here that there are these giant robot-like devices buried across the country. And we're trying to see if there is a full one buried. So we're trying to find out why they're here, how they got here, when they're from, and what the next step is. can this giant robot even be put together? Those are some of the questions that we're asking in the first book, and then it kind of goes off from there. My favorites in this were book 1 and book 3. I gave both of those 4.5 stars. I gave book number 2 4 stars. Still a great book. Just I liked the scope and some of like the politics of, specifically the third one was probably my favorite of the bunch, but the first one got me hooked, and so of course that one was excellent as well. But this is just a larger than life story that I loved. If you like sci-fi, if you like Pacific Rim, like I said, kaiju movies, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't enjoy this. I definitely recommend this one. So I ended up giving this series on average 4.5 out of 5 stars. So I loved it. So I cannot recommend the Themis Files trilogy by Sylvain Neuvel enough, and it ends up at number 9 on my list. Number 8 on my list is the first true crime book, but it will not be the last as we go through here. This is Columbine, written by Dave Cullen. So this was one that I thought I had an idea of what happened during the Columbine massacre, kind of the things leading up to it, who the shooters were, things like that. But I was wrong on almost every level. Like this book was just eye-opening. It was a revelation in terms of how the media, if they get things wrong, because the media got things wrong so much in those first 72 hours, those first 3 days. And I just, as a, what was I, like 11, 12 years old when this happened. So I wasn't a huge news watcher, of course, but this was a big story, so I was following this a little bit, and I just remember hearing all these things like the Trenchcoat Mafia. I mean, just so many different things that just turned out to be incorrect. But even though they eventually turned out to be false, like I never heard about it on the news coming out and saying, oh, this was wrong and this was wrong. Instead, over the next however many years now, since 1999, I've believed certain things about the Columbine massacre that are just not correct. So if you have any interest in true crime, or you were, around, if you're around my age or if you're older and you remember the Columbine massacre and how that kind of just set things off on a new path in America in a very negative way, if that interests you at all, then I cannot recommend this enough. This to me is like the definitive story of Columbine. Dave Cullen just does an exhaustively researched book here. It is fascinating. It's horrifying. It's incredibly sad. I cannot tell you how many times I teared up while reading this. Like, it is just horrifying, but absolutely worth knowing about. So Columbine by Dave Cullen falls in at number 8 on my list. So the only graphic novel on my list is going to come in at number 7, and this is Wicked and the Divine, Book 1 by Kieran Gillen. So this one absolutely blew me away when I read it. So I actually own volume 1. I've owned it for a long time, and I read it years ago of this, which would have been like issues 1 through 5, I believe. The deluxe edition book 1 that I read that I'm talking about today was issues 1 through 11. So when I read volume 1, I thought it was good, but it wasn't something that I ever rushed out to continue on, which I understand now why that is. It's because volume 1 is only really half of an arc. Like, it's not the full arc that is book 1. So while there is a bit of like a wow moment at the end of volume 1, or, issue 5, I guess it would be, really it's not until you get to issue 11 where it just takes things to a whole nother level and just absolutely blew my mind. Like, my jaw was agape when I read the final pages of issue 11. So the last pages of book 1, it was awesome and completely unexpected. And then it just takes the story into like a whole nother direction. In book 2, while it was really good, it didn't quite live up to book number 1 for me. And I think some of that also has to do with the art. They did a lot of, experimenting, I guess, with different artists in book 2, that I didn't always love, where book 1 was very consistent, and I loved that. So though book 2 is still great and I recommend it, book 1 was really the wow for me, and I can't recommend it enough. I do have a full review of this on the channel, so if you're interested in my more expanded thoughts, definitely check that out here on the channel. But The Wicked and the Divine, book 1 by Kieran Gillen, ends up at number 7 on my list, and it was awesome. Number 6 on my list was a really fun horror book. This is called The Forgotten Island, written by David Sodergren. So this is one that I actually have, but I didn't grab any of the physical books I still own for whatever reason, because a lot of these were done on audiobook. Some of them were done via the library. But I do have a few of these in my physical collection still. I just didn't grab them for this. But either way, this was one that I got for my birthday from my wife, and I read it maybe a month or 2 after I got it, and it was just a blast. Like, I read through this book so quickly, which is unusual for for me. It has to be really good to make me want to just keep going, and that's exactly what The Forgotten Island did. So in The Forgotten Island, we are following a pair of sisters, and our main character is the older sister who is kind of like the Eeyore of the group, I guess. She's going through a rough time in her life, and she's there with her sister, her younger sister, and her sister's boyfriend, who is a real jerk. So she's not having the best time, but one night she meets this guy, and things start turning around. I think the next day is when they decide to go out on this boat trip together, but things go wrong on the boat trip, and they end up trapped, and eventually they float to this island. They see smoke in the distance, so a couple of them say, hey, let's go see if we can find a way to get help, because we don't have any clothes, we don't have any sunscreen, and the sun's beating down on them, we don't have any cell phones, let's see if we can find help. And of course, things take off from there. So this is definitely a horror story that is very brutal, very gruesome, super bloody, and it is just awesome if you like those things. It also has elements of like Lovecraft. It's very Lovecraftian horror, which honestly, if I knew that going into it, I probably wouldn't have picked this book up, but I would have been doing myself a disservice because I loved it. These Lovecraftian elements that they add into this are so awesome. It is just such a fun book. It is like, a popcorn B movie, but done in book form, and I cannot recommend that enough if you are a horror fan. So I actually have Night Shoot, which is another book written by David Sodergren, and that it looks like it's like a slasher film done in book form, so super excited to check out his next book. He has a handful, but that's the one that really is catching my eye next. So excited to read more from David Sodergren because he's an awesome writer who the pace was crazy. It kept going and going, and I loved it. So number 6 on my list is The Forgotten Island by David Sodergren. All right, we are halfway there, so now we're in the top 5. So number 5 on my list is True Crime Addict, written by James Renner. So I know I talked about this one relatively recently because I only read it a few months back, but this was a true crime book that anyone interested in true crime needs to read because it is incredible. So this is the story of how James Renner, the author, basically became obsessed with the Maura Murray case and how he got into true crime also. So not only are we learning the story of Maura Murray, which is utterly fascinating. It is an unsolved mystery, but basically it is this like all-American girl. She is going through a rough time, unbeknownst to most people. She drives away from her university, and she ends up crashing and kind of in the middle of nowhere on this road. A person who lives nearby drives by, happens to see her, asks if she needs help. She says, no, I already called the police. He leaves and goes home. He knows that she can't call the police because there's no service out there. So he calls. There's a 7-minute gap between when that man leaves her and when the cops show up. And in that 7 minutes, Maura Murray has disappeared and no one has ever seen her since. Nobody knows what happened. So it is basically, he doesn't have answers for this, of course, but he asks a lot of really good questions and a lot of interesting questions. So you have that aspect of Maura Murray of this book, and that is fascinating to read. But then you also have the aspect of James Renner and learning about his history, which I have read some negative reviews about that aspect of the book, about how James Renner portrays himself, but I did not find him to be unlikable at all. I thought he was quite humble, and his story is just interesting. How he got to where he is today is just interesting to read about. So I thoroughly enjoyed this. I ended up giving this one 4.5 out of 5 stars when I read it, and again, it is just a true crime must if you are a reader of that genre. So really enjoyed this one. This is True Crime Addict, written by James Renner, coming in at number 5. So 2020 was a bit of an interesting year because I only read 5 books that I ended up giving 5 stars to, and one of them was Night by Elie Wiesel, which I've already read before, so that doesn't count for this list. So the next 4 are all 5-star reads, and they are the only first-time 5-star reads that I read in 2020. So number 4 is Joyland, written by Stephen King. So I know this one, a lot of people are going to be turning up their nose at it because they just don't like it. There is a full review of my thoughts on this book on the channel, so definitely check that out. I go into a lot more detail than I'm about to here, but basically this is a character study. We are following a young man in between semesters of college. He had just had a bad breakup, and so instead of going back to school at the end of his summer at Joyland, which is an amusement park, he decides to stay on for the winter. And just the characters he meets and the situations he gets himself into, the eventually like the ghost story that pops up out of this, it was just so fascinating to me. I loved this character and I wanted to see everything that happened to him, and Stephen King just does characters better than anybody on the planet that I've read so far. He is a master at it. And this was just that. It was a slow burn character study, and I adored it. So I gave, again, these are all 5 stars that I'm talking about now. So of course I gave it 5 stars. Cannot recommend it enough if you know what you're getting into. This is not a typical Stephen King book. There are horror elements. It's not even a typical hard case crime book, which is who published this, which I love. It's not a crime novel, but it feels more like a crime book than a Stephen King horror book, but it's just like a mixture of those two, but then something completely different on top of it. It is a slow burn character study. If that sounds interesting to you, check it out. I love this one. So number 4 on my list, Joyland by Stephen King. Number 3 is another true crime book, and this is Call Me God, the untold story of the DC sniper investigation, written by the Clementi brothers, who were basically 2 of the pivotal characters in tracking down the DC snipers. So this is actually an Audible original, so it's not really a book. Like, you're not even able to pick this up in paperback or hardcover. You have to listen to it via Audible. So some people might consider this more of a podcast than a book, but whatever, it doesn't matter. It's on Goodreads. I'm counting it as a book, and it lands in at number 3. So I knew virtually nothing about the DC sniper investigation coming into this, other than the fact that it happened. And oh my gosh, I was blown away by the scope of this story. It's not just in DC. It takes place across the United States and even in another country. It is crazy, the story that of these 2 DC snipers. This is another book that was just super emotional for me to read as I was going through it, because of the randomness of the crimes, the senselessness of the crimes, the just coldness of the whole thing was terrifying, saddening, just horrific. Because this is done in podcast style, you do get like first-hand interviews from some of the victims' remaining family members. And to me, that was the hardest part to get through, because these people are still in mourning years later, obviously, because their family members died for no reason at all. And getting to hear these family members discuss the events from their own mouths was very special to the Audible original, because in book form, you might have it in written down, but it's different when you're actually hearing them talk. You hear them break up, talking about what happened on those days. I mean, like, seriously, just senseless, horrific crimes. When I say senseless, I mean it is the definition of needless and senseless. You have people that were filling up their minivan at the gas station. You have somebody who was just shopping at a store. You have a young boy who was going to school, and he gets shot in the gut. Fortunately, he survived, but the others I'm talking about, they did pass. And then you have somebody who is in the Home Depot parking lot filling up their car after having purchased some things to fix up their house. Like, it is just the most random, horrible just events that happened with these DC sniper investigation. So I cannot recommend this one enough. If you are at all interested in true crime, or you want to know more about specifically the DC sniper case, because you're getting it from not only the victims' families, but you're also getting it from people that tracked these men down in order to catch them and bring them to justice. So I highly recommend this one. Another one, of course, I gave 5 stars, and it is just a true crime classic in my book. So number 3 on my list is Call Me God, written by the Clementi brothers, an Audible original that I highly recommend. I apologize if you are not a true crime reader at all, but number 2 on my list is also a true crime book, and this is The Stranger Beside Me, written by Anne Rule. So this was one that I was always interested in reading because I'd always heard good things about it, and finally I put it on my list to read last year, and I did get to it, and I'm so happy that I did, because this was just a perfect storm of terror, basically. With this book, you have a once-in-a-lifetime encounter. You have Anne Rule, who would eventually go on to be arguably one of the greatest true crime writers of all time. And then you have Ted Bundy, who would eventually go on to be one of the most prolific, horrifying serial killers of all time. The chances that these two would not only meet, but become actual friends at a job at a suicide prevention hotline, the odds of that happening are just astronomical, and it's likely something that you would never see again in the future. This was absolutely fascinating if you are a true crime reader. To me, this is the quintessential true crime book because of the situation. So Anne Rule and Ted Bundy were friends when they both worked at a suicide prevention hotline a number of years before Ted Bundy got into the spotlight as this potential killer that he, of course, is or was. And I always thought that that was just like, you know, kind of a marketing ploy to get people interested. Oh, they may have worked at the same company together or something like that, but probably weren't the best of friends. Well, they weren't best friends, but they were very close at work. Like, they were genuine friends. They talked all the time. They shared like their problems that they were having on the outside. Anne Rule was going through like a divorce and things like that. Ted Bundy was going through things with his then girlfriend. They shared those kind of like personal moments together. And they actually talked all the way through until Bundy was eventually, tried and everything. They were communicating that whole time. And just seeing it from Anne Rule's side was fascinating. As I've said, I probably used the word fascinating 100 times already talking about this book, but it really was. Just the way Anne Rule writes this story is something to behold, because you do get the relationship between her and Ted Bundy, which is just insane to think about. But then you also get the proper amount of respect paid to the victims. This is an incredibly detailed and very disturbing account of what happens, because she doesn't pull any punches, but at the same time, she's very respectful to the victims and to the survivors of Ted Bundy, which I think is just so important when it comes to true crime writing, and she does it flawlessly. This is one that makes me want to read a lot more Anne Rule, which I do plan to do here in the near future, because the way she writes is just wonderful. So if you, again, have any interest in true crime, to me, this is the book to read. If you want to read one true crime book in your life, read Anne Rule's The Stranger Beside Me, which falls in at number 2 on my top 10 books that I read in 2020. So I do have a list of honorable mentions, and this was initially like a dozen long, but I cut it down because I don't want to spend time talking about these, but I do want them mentioned as some of my favorites that I read last year. So let's rapid fire through these as quickly as we can. We have Thor Volume 1, The Goddess of Thunder, written by Jason Aaron, Lady Thor, incredible. Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back by Donald F. Glutt, my favorite of the Star Wars novelizations. Paperbacks from Hell by Grady Hendrix. Though it wasn't perfect, it was very much worth my time, and I'm really glad I read it. Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, awesome sci-fi. The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. Barker's probably the best horror writer I've ever read in terms of how he uses language. And then finally, Star Wars Galaxy of Fear, the entire series written by John Whitman. I cannot tell you guys enough how much I loved that middle grade series this year, so had to end up on my honorable mentions. Okay, we are here at number 1. My favorite book that I read for the first time in 2020 is The Institute, written by Stephen King. And I know some of you are probably moaning, oh, you already had a Stephen King book on your list. This is so predictable. Last year, my number 1 was It by Stephen King. Well, that's okay. That's just the way it goes sometimes. I loved this. This was actually a pre-pandemic read for me. So I did it on audiobook, and I was able to do it while I was still driving 5 days a week, 2 hours a day. So I was able to get through this one really quickly, which I'm really glad, because I kept wanting to get to this. Like, I wanted to devour it as quickly as I could while I was reading it, because it was so interesting. I loved it. So here we are following the story of this young boy. In the middle of the night, his whole family is murdered, and he wakes up in this room that looks remarkably similar to his room, but it's just a little bit off. And it turns out that he is actually at the titular institute. He is there with some other children who are all gifted. They have some powers, telekinesis, telepathy, things like that, which he also shares. And so we are basically following his story and whether or not he will stay here, get out, survive. We follow the friends he meets along the way. There's just the characters in this book are the reason I love it, which again, I talked about it in Joyland. For my money, I am not the most prolific reader in the world, so take it with a grain of salt, but with what I've read so far, nobody builds characters quite as well as Stephen King does, and this is just a wonderful example of that. There is also the story of like an adult in this as well, who has a very interesting story that him and the child's stories, they kind of, eventually they're going to come together, of course, in one way or another, which I won't spoil anything, but just the second half of this book is just a roller coaster ride for me. I loved it. So I read this one almost a year ago now, so I'll admit I don't remember every little detail of this story, but what I do remember is the emotions I felt while reading this story. I was on the edge of my seat. I was holding my breath at points, wanting to know what was going to happen next. I was not crying. I was laughing out loud at points. Like, this was awesome. Stephen King was just a master of manipulating my emotions with this book, and I loved every minute of it. So while this might not be the most unpredictable or unexpected choice, especially from me, this was without a doubt my favorite book that I read in 2020. So number one on the list is The Institute, written by Stephen King, who is now 2 years running for my favorite book of the year, both 2019 with It and then 2020 with The Institute. So we'll see what 2021 brings. And that is going to do it for my top 10 first-time reads of 2020. This video probably ended up being significantly longer than I hoped it would, but hopefully you guys still enjoyed it. And again, I know this is probably not going to be the same as your list. One, because we all read different things for the first time last year. But two, even if you were to rank these books, I'm sure you'd put them in a different order than I did. And that's totally fine. This is my list. So I want to know your list down in the comments below. What were your top 5 even, top 3 favorite reads of 2020 that you did for the first time? That's something I love to hear from you guys about. So let me know down in the comments below so we can have more of a conversation down there. And as always, if you guys enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Cinefessions here on YouTube. And if not, well, thank you for watching this one. I really do appreciate that. And like I always say, I don't just talk books, I talk all things media, be it books, movies, video games, graphic novels. If it's media related, I'm interested. And if you are too, you might consider subscribing. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today. I just want to say thank you all so much for watching. And I want to encourage you to consume some media today. I'll catch you next time.